changes. started with drag. Alright. First things first, gotta have water. Let's get into it. We're gonna go ahead and cover some topics about drag today. We're gonna go ahead and learn about essentially the majority of all the drags that are known and what to think about them when we design. So let's get into it. What is drag? That's the primary question. What is drag? It's a force. You'll find that this is very similar to the lift video I did back on lift. Alright, so we have a force. And what it does is it's parallel to the incoming flow. Drag, we use our combats here. The two forces that we want to have on our vehicles: thrust and lift. Alright, so let's go ahead and draw ourselves a plane here. Alright, so here's our plane. And we know from the last one, if this is our velocity coming in. We know that our lift force is perpendicular to that. So we'll say our lift force looks something like this. This guy is shooting out via jet engine, so its thrust force is this direction. We're saying that down here is the Earth. Oh God. Oh, stop. There we go. Earth. So this is our weight force. So our drag force, if our velocity is in line with the supersonic line, we'll say, of our body, then our drag force is going to be in this direction, parallel with the velocity incoming. Now let's draw our plane again. This time we're going to draw our plane at an angle. Hopefully the music isn't too loud. Real high angle of attack here. And we're just saying it just did a pull-up maneuver. So the velocity is still like this. Then we find out, draw an axis line. We'll find out that our lift force is still like this. Find that our thrust force, like this, here's the Earth. So our weight force is still directly down. And then our drag force is like this. And then this force right here is our angle of attack. Turn the music down just a little more here. Just a little more. can see here from this picture, drag is not always in line with your body axis. It is in line with your flow axis. What's up, Andy? How you doing, brother? Alright, so that's what drag is. It's a force. It's related to the incoming flow, and it combats thrust and friction. Alright, let's go ahead and move on to our first thing. Parasitic and profile drag. First thing we're going to need to mention here is that the difference between these two is that this one right here refers to a 3D problem. This one right here refers to a 2D problem. Alright, so what's a 2D problem? A 2D problem is if we have our airfoil. This is a 2D case. We're only looking at it in our X and our Z components. Thus, 2D. So what is a 3D problem? Well, a 3D problem would be if we're looking at, say, for example, same airfoil here on the roof. I'm going to go ahead and say it comes to a tip. So now we are looking at a full wing. This is a 3D problem. Here, we have our X, Y, and Z. So this is parasitic and profile drag. Now, what exactly are the parasitic and profile drags? Well, by definition, they're the same thing, but what they're used for is not. So, by definition, they are the sum is the drag from your pressure drag and your viscous drag. Cool. Okay, so this is merely a sum of different kinds of drag, those being the pressure drag and the viscous drag. Now, the pressure and the viscous drag are our two main types of drag subsets. So let's go ahead and talk about those now. Pressure drag. Pressure drag is drag from pressure. Viscous drag is drag from viscous effects. Geez, who would have ever guessed that that's what those meant? Alright. So when we say drag from pressure, we are relating specifically to differences in pressure causing drag. So then from viscous, we're talking about viscous effect being succession as an example here. Friction forces causing drag. Alright, so with that, we'll get into our very first kind of drag. Skin friction. Now, the biggest thing we need to know about skin friction drag is that skin friction drag, on average, especially on like airliners, is usually about some 60% of the total drag. It is the highest contributing. It is the highest contributor to the overall drag you will have on your aero vehicle. Okay. What is skin friction drag? Skin friction drag is the drag due to viscous friction / interaction between your medium, so in our case we'll think of air as our flow medium, and a surface. So, if you have some flat plate, for example, and we have some flow going over it, there's going to be an interaction between the surface and the medium with this coefficient called mu. This is our viscosity coefficient. Additionally, however, if we look at that same molecule, and we draw a second molecule above it, we'll find that here we also have a viscosity coefficient. So on the molecular and atomic level, the molecules of air are rubbing against each other. And this is why, if you remember from the lift video, we had our boundary layer. So why does this create drag? Well, as you try and move your body through the air, as it's coming in contact with the air, because of that friction, it is going to attempt to prevent the body from moving through it. That is what viscous friction is. Imagine if you had a cup of water, and then say a cup of syrup. Imagine both you can see through, and you dropped a marble into it. If you drop the marble into the water, you already know it's just going to make a plonk sound and go straight to the bottom. If you drop it in syrup, it'll make kind of a thicker plonk sound, and it'll take a decent amount longer to get to the bottom of the cup because of the viscosity coefficient of syrup. So this is essentially what skin friction drag is. It is the viscous relation between your surface and the medium. Alright, first equation of the day. It is the coefficient of friction, or skin friction. And we write it as tau over Q. We're just, I guess tau over 1/2 rho d squared. We'll write our infinity signs here so we know it's the free flow condition. This is the shear stress over 1/2 times density times velocity squared at free flow conditions. Now shear stress is, we're just talking about two objects sliding across each other. One cool idea of the shear stress idea is earthquakes. When two tectonic plates are rubbing against each other, once they move with an excited force, you have an earthquake. Okay. Let's see here. sometimes in your textbook you will see your shear stress written as tau W. Tau W is still shear stress, but this W here is related to the wing. For the sake of the coefficient, though, we're not writing W because we can use this for things other than just wings. Okay, so this is our coefficient for shear stress. Now, the thing is that this doesn't really help us if we don't have shear stress. So we have but in subsonic flow, we have similar things. So let's take a look at our subsonic flow cases. We get two equations. We get CF equals 1.328 divided by the square root of REC, and we get CF equals 0.074 over REC to 1/5. Now what we find out here is that these two are subsonic cases for laminar flow and for turbulent flow. Now, we're going to go ahead and describe laminar and turbulent flow here before we move on so that they're understood. So say we have our airfoil again. That's our airfoil. Now, as we have our boundary layer, something like this, and then something like this. This beginning part here, so right about here, what we call laminar flow. In other words, all of our flow right here nicely moves in a very streamlined, oriented way. It moves along the airflow. Then we have this small little region right here called the transitional area. And what we find in the transitional area is that our flow suddenly starts to do this. It has a little bit of a vertical component with respect to the airfoil. And then after that, we have the turbulent flow. And we find in the turbulent area that our flow is suddenly really excited. It has huge contributions in the vertical direction. If we were to look at our flat plate again, and we draw our boundary layer, here we go transitional, and then vertical. Do the same things again. These are our laminar area, our transitional area, and our turbulent area. Again, we're going to draw a straight line. It would look something like this. Now, in our turbulent area, what we actually get is something called eddies. See if I can find this picture of eddies. Here's an eddy right here. So these are what eddies are. It happens in turbulent flow. Let's do something like this. It's named after somebody named Eddy. It's a phenomenon of gains a very a vertical portion of its velocity is now turned into these so-called ends. So we go back and just draw that. Here's our straight area and laminar flow. Become transitional, turbulent, and then our turbulent area looks something like this. These are our ends. So what does this mean for us in terms of the coefficient of friction? Well, in the laminar flow region, the coefficient of friction is much different than that in turbulent regions. And in the turbulent regions, you have a lot more drag. And you would find that calculating your turbulent flow steam friction for that laminar flow steam friction, that you actually get more frictional drag in turbulent flow. So let's go ahead and take a look at these So we have 1.328 over the root of REC and 0.074 over REC. Alright, so what is RE? RE stands for the Reynolds number. Now the Reynolds number is very important in aerodynamics. It tells you a lot about the flow characteristics. Specifically, those what's happening kinematically over viscous. These aren't really words, but I'm making words. Okay. Now we find out the Reynolds number is written out as rho UL over mu, your viscosity. Okay, we have our density, our velocity, a reference length, and then your viscous coefficient. Okay, so that's the Reynolds number. Now, what does the subscript C stand for? This relates to the entire body. I want to make this very clear. It relates to the 2D body. Now, if you ever see this, REX, this relates to a point. On the 2D body. So, if I draw my airfoil again, find that here we have our chord length, C, this chord length. And that's what this C and RDC relates to, chord length for the entire body. Now, the reason why we refer to X is because we have, say, some distance on the chord length from, say, here to here. This might be X. What's happening at this point right here? Right? We'll call that C of X. We're going to draw our coordinate system. Like this. So C of X is a certain point, and we can find the Reynolds number at any given point too. So by doing that, if you calculate your Reynolds number at any given point in your airflow, you can actually tell when the boundary layer changes from laminar over to turbulent. With a slight buffer zone, and that's called the transitional area. So, going from there, what have we got?
Alright, I probably sound a little bit different now. I checked over and my stream was using the wrong microphone this entire time. I was so confused. Okay, back to it though, yeah? Where was I? Yes, Reynolds number. So, this is what the Reynolds number is. It's your density, velocity, reference length, or viscous coefficient. And it's your kinematics. So let's say we have... I'll go and just give you an example. Laminar flow is usually under a Reynolds number of 2 times 10 to the 5th. So we're going to go ahead and use REC equals 2 times 10 to the 5th for our laminar region. And then we're going to use REC equals 5 times 10 to the 6th for our turbulent region. Now we're going to go ahead and plug it into those subsonic regions, subsonic formulas I gave you. So using the laminar one, we get CF is going to be 1.328 over the root of 2 times 10 to the 5th. Uh, 1.328 over root 2 times 10 to the 5. We'll get 2.97 10 to the negative 3. And then if we use our turbulent one, let's go and just write it out. 5 times 10 to the 6th, so 1/5. Get 0.074 over 5 times 10 to the 6th, so the 1/5. We get 3.38 times 10 to the negative 3. Now we're just going to say that Q, for the sake of this, equals 1/2. We'll say we're at sea level, so density is going to be 1.225. And we'll say that this plane is moving at 120 meters per second. We'll square that. We get 0.5 times 1.225 times 120. 23.5. So then we're just going to multiply each one of those values. And we're going to get our shear stress on for our laminar flow. So that times 2.97 times 10 to the negative 3. 218, and then we get shear on our turbulent. .248. And as you can see from this, the drag from turbulence is more than that from laminar flow. So it's important to know that. It's also very important to know that your bodies are going to have a turbulent flow. It's very hard to keep a laminar flow across the entire body. So whenever you design something, it is of good practice to do this for everything. Now, let's say, for the sake of this example, that our flow right here, correct, is on a symmetric body. For the sake of a symmetric body, I'm actually going to draw a supersonic airfoil here. A modified double wedge. Now, if we find this shear, we draw a line straight through, what we actually just found was the shear on one side. So, for your symmetric bodies, your actual CF, or your actual shear, right? So we'll say CF total in the 2D plane is 2 times the CF that you found. Now, if we are looking at the 3D plane, take some airfoil here. Boop. Swoop. We have some wing. The actual CF in the 3D plane is equal to the integral of all your CFs at any given y from root to tip. So your root is going to have its own CF. Your tip is going to have its own CF. And then any section we take out of the wing is also going to have its own CF. Now the reason why I'm using Y here, because if we look at our plane, this is our X, this is our Z, and then as we go down the plane, our Y. If you would like, I can draw that more in line. There you go. Alright. So that's our coordinate system that we're using here. So in order to get the total coefficient across the entire wing, you would have to take the sum from the root to the tip of all of your coefficients, and that requires you using an integral of all your coefficients down the wing. And that is your coefficient of skin friction. Now there's a few more things that have to be mentioned before we move on. So, what happens when we get to supersonic speeds? And we're not going to cover transonic speeds today, but we will go ahead and touch upon supersonic. And in supersonic, our equations change a little bit. For laminar flow, I'm going lam right here, we find that it is a function of what's called ME, PR, TW, let me make sure I'm writing this correctly. Yes. TWTE over the root, REC. And then for your turbulent layer, it is a function of that same ME, PR, TWTE over REC to the 1/5. Now these functions that we have here first we have ME. And here, this is our Mach number at the edge of the boundary layer. So if we go back up and take a look at our boundary layer, right? The edge of our boundary layer would be here. Now, this is important because the boundary layer, we talked about this before when we talked about lift, the velocity inside the boundary layer goes from 0 up to essentially what is the current free stream. And so, it is important to know how thick the boundary layer is, and that is something that can be found out. We use the symbol small delta, and this refers to the boundary layer thickness. We will not be going to boundary layer thickness for today. I just want to cover that in supersonic flow, the equation is different because it is now a function of more things. This can be found in the Anderson textbook. I believe they go into depth on chapters 12 and 13 on this specifically, and I think it's first mentioned in chapters 8 and 9. So, moving on. PR is what's called the Prandtl number, named after Ludwig Prandtl, very, very influential person in the field of aerodynamics. And then TW over TE, this ratio is, let me just make sure I say it correctly. Yes. It is the ratio of temperature. It's the temperature ratio. More specifically, it is the temp at wall over the temp at boundary edge. So if we draw a flat plate, draw our boundary layer, so it looks like this. We're in the laminar area right now. At this point right here, we're going to have TW. Now, if we draw a line through it, this right here, we have our T wall. Oh, I drew the wrong subscript. There we go. And these temperatures are going to be different. The temperature at the wall should be higher than that of the temperature at the edge of the boundary layer because of frictional effects. Alright, so that's what the temperature ratio refers to. And everything is functions of these. REC is the same thing as we talked as before. Another thing that should be noted is that mu changes with temperature. In thermodynamics, you will learn that for gases, as the temperature goes up, mu will go up. For liquids, as the temperature goes up, the viscosity will actually go down. So, especially when we start dealing with like supersonics and especially hypersonics, it's important to understand that mu is not something that we can just leave as a constant. Typically, it's just left as a constant, but for specific answers, we need to understand that it is in fact reliant on temperature. Alright, and that covers skin friction drag. So let's go and move on to our next large component in drag, form drag. Alright, so what is form drag? Form drag is a type of pressure drag and it is caused by the form of a body creating pressure gradients. We talked about pressure gradients in the lift video I made back on Sunday. That generate drag. Okay. So what does this exactly mean? This means, for example, let's take a look at our airfoil. Now, back on Sunday we talked about with this airfoil, at some point, we have a region of separation. And what this means is that this region of separation, how should we describe it? Region of separation has this pressure that is going to be higher, which you would want. Right, we talked about this last week. I'll go ahead and just explain via words. The separation causes a higher pressure than what you would want if it was not separated, therefore reducing lift. But in terms of form drag, what we care about is the fact that in the front here, you get this really high pressure that starts off, and then it turns into a lower pressure as you go toward the back. And what happens is this higher pressure wants to move back toward the lower pressure. And as that happens, it creates a drag force. It creates a drag that pushes your body backwards. And this is drag due to form. Now, let's say we have an airfoil at a really high angle of attack, right? You're going to have this really high amount of pressure starting out on the front, and this really low amount of pressure in the back. And that's going to cause this high amount of pressure and form drag that pushes the wing backwards. Additionally, you have this huge amount of separation most likely happening. And behind here we just have this turbulent airflow. It's separated, and this will also help add on to the idea of increased drag. Because it is separated, it's turbulent. We already talked once that the turbulent region, first of all, will add to skin friction, but if it's completely just separated now, then the pressure there, it's still going to be lower than that in the front. So no matter what happens here, you're going to have this form drag pushing back against you. Now, while we're on this subject of pressure, there's a very, very important thing called D'Alembert's, or D'Alembert's. I hope I pronounced it right. I hope I'm spelling it right too, while I'm at that. Paradox. Now what this says is that in viscid flow, and we talked about inviscid flow as well in the previous video. Inviscid flow is we're neglecting viscous effects. What we find is that the flow stays attached. And what happens is, let's say we have some airfoil. If the airflow stays attached, the entire time across. We find out that the pressure going in is equivalent to the pressure going out. And because of this, a pressure gradient isn't caused, and the delta P equals 0, and therefore, no drag from form drag, from the form. Now we know this not to be true, and it's because of the viscous effect. The viscous effect causes the separations, and because of separation, you cannot have an equal amount of pressure on the front as that in the back when you sum it all up. That pressure gradient will not equal 0. Now, when we get to things like supersonic, we added wave drag. D'Alembert's paradox, even in inviscid flow, doesn't hold true. So, things are still satisfied there. But in inviscid subsonic flows, you cannot have form drag if you do not account for viscosity. And this is called D'Alembert's paradox. But once we added viscous effects and we have the boundary layer, we see that the flow starts to get weird. Get some separation here. Then we find out that the pressure going in doesn't relate to the pressure going out. This is viscous flow. There we go. Alright. So that's the basis of form drag. It is the essential drag that you have that is created by pressure and pressure differences. We go back to our wall that I drew in the very first time. You have a whole bunch of people over on this side. There's just 2 people over here. They're going to push against this wall to try and get to the other side. They don't want them to come over and take up some of their space, so they push back. You get 2 people versus, how many do we got here? 8 people. You get a resultant force of 6 people. And in this case, this will be our form drag. And if you look, once again, the symbol for people is the same as pressure. Alright, let's go ahead and move on now. So we talked about our two main types. Skin friction and form drag. Alright, the next one we're going to go ahead and go on to now is, I'm just going to do this out of order of what I originally thought. We're going to go ahead and talk about induced drag. So what is induced drag? Induced drag is drag created due to the creation of lift. Sometimes you also hear it called lift-induced drag. This song's way too overplayed. Alright, lift-induced drag. So, first let's go and take a look at a wing. Look at this, a skinny wing. Alright, here we go. So here's our wing. what we end up getting is that at the wingtips, we get vortices. We talked about this before. But also, we get span-wise flow. And then on the bottom, we get it in the opposite direction. And what happens is, we get two kinds of induced drags here. The first type is vorticical. I think I spelled that right. Induced drag. This is a pressure drag. The second one we get is viscous induced drag. This is due to a viscous force. Okay, so we find out here we have the two different kinds of induced drags. Let's talk about number one. Vortex drag. So what we get here is induced vortex drag sums up to the wingtip. Which is when we see the wingtip vortices. We also find that vortices increase drag. So as we have the vortice, this is a 2D view head on. What we're finding here is that the velocity isn't really going directly straight out anymore. It is now in a rotational flow. And what happens is that in that rotational flow, you have a vertical component of velocity now. Therefore, the horizontal velocity is slower, and therefore the velocity is moving slower out of this control volume, you could say. And because of that, we get a pressure gradient caused at the wingtips. And this pressure gradient is caused by the lift occurring, and it adds on to the drag that we were going to see. Give me 1 second. Yes. All right. So, let's go on, move number 2. We're going to talk about the viscous induced drag. Give me a second as I take a quick swig. Alright. So what do we get out of this induced drag? So what happens is, as the airflow now moves horizontally over the wing due to pressure differences, If we remember. Oops. Let's try and draw that better. We get a low pressure up here and a high pressure down here. So what happens is, because of the high pressure here, the airflow moves towards the tip. And on the top, the airflow moves toward the root. Okay. And because it now has that horizontal component of velocity, you now get skin friction drag in the horizontal component instead of in the component that's only parallel with that of the free flow. Called span-wise flow. There we go. Pretty much as simple as that. And that's shown by these arrows right here. The green is under, the white is on top of the airfoil, or on top of the wing. And you can see the that it now has a horizontal component instead of just the axial component, we'll say. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that when we talked about our first skin friction drag, relates to the square of velocity. I spelled square wrong. No, I didn't. Square of velocity. Whereas viscous induced drag relates to the velocity. So, skin friction drag and the action component from skin friction as we first talked about it. As the velocity increases, it'll increase more in skin friction than it will in the viscous induced drag region. Now, one of the ways we calculate this, here's our next equation of the day, is we have CD, this is for a subsonic plane. We'll just say for a plane in general. It's written as CDO plus CDI, which is our zero lift drag coefficient plus the lift induced drag coefficient. Now, the zero lift drag coefficient is simply that, is the amount of drag you get without generating any lift. And the lift induced drag is the drag you get due to that lift being created. So for an asymmetric airfoil, for example, at a single of zero lift, that would be a fine way of calculating something like that. Now, in order to calculate CDI, which is what we are caring about right now, since we're talking about induced drag, CDI is going to be equal to this simple equation: KCL squared, which is a We're going to relate to this as the Oswald... No, we're not going to. Not yet. Not just yet. We're going to consider this an efficiency factor. Times the coefficient of lift. Squared. Now, the other way to write this is CL squared over pi AR EO. Now, we're going to relate to this as the Oswald efficiency factor here. More specifically, this part here is the efficiency factor. I've seen it referred to as both ways. Oswald efficiency factor related directly to this E naught, but also to the entire statement. And so what this says is that this efficiency factor K is equal to 1 over pi times AR times E0, which is going to be equal to 1 over pi times your aspect ratio times the efficiency factor. And this entire thing right here comes from what's called the lifting line theory. And the lifting line theory is a theory used in order to find the amount of lift that you get from a wing. It's one of numerous theories. There's other theories, such as the panel method. And so we use these different theories that are all based in certain assumptions that are made in order to calculate our total lift that we have. Okay. So this also means that we have some kind of semblance between our drag and our lift, which is really, really nice. So this is where we are at for induced drag. Let's see where we're at in time. Alright, 208. Cool. About an hour and we're already about halfway through. So we're doing good. We're gonna do a quick bathroom break. And we're back. Alright. Use the bathroom. And I got myself some Hershey's. Not sponsored. We got cookies and cream right here, so let's get into it. Okay. So we went over Induced Drag. So now we're going to go over Interference Drag. Alright. So what is Interference Drag? It's the drag due to the interference of two flows. So imagine we have, this is the fuselage of a plane right here. And then we have the wing. Might look a little something like this, the wing. We're not going to go all the way down. But what you're going to have is you're going to have this region of interference right here. And the reason why is because you have the flow along the fuselage right here. And then you have the flow along the wing right here. And what happens is that we talked about those boundary layers. And the flow between these two are going to interfere. So you can imagine colliding boundary layers. And we were talking about the viscous effect that happens in here. And so you have even more molecules interfering. But since they're at angles to each other, if they hit into each other, and they might be moving at different speeds because of their respective boundary layers, what you're going to get is the molecules are going to start bouncing around, and they're not going to be exactly streamlined anymore. They're going to start having different velocity components. Now this is going to help increase drag because of just interfering boundary layers having viscous effects on each other. But this can also affect your pressure drag. And the reason why is because if you have two flows interfering, this can change the velocity. And if you start changing your velocities, you start changing your pressure. And if you start changing your pressure at certain points, then you start getting different pressure gradients. So it's a huge thing about the form drag. So once you start changing pressures, they will start to counteract each other. Alright, time for another bite of the Hershey's bar. Okay. Fuselage flow. Wing flow. Interference area. Now, a lot of the times whenever we talk about the association between the wing root and the body, general term for it is the wing body. This is not to be confused with a literal wing body concept. A wing body airplane is not the same as the wing body we're talking about here. Same thing as a flying wing. It's not the same thing as what we're talking about here. Okay. And in case you don't know the difference between that, your generic plane, you can imagine like a C-130. You have your fuselage and you have your wings attached. Flying wing, you think of the B-2 bomber, the Spirit, and the entire plane is an airfoil. It's designed as an airfoil all the way through. A wing body aircraft is an aircraft where the wing very smoothly transitions into the body or the fuselage of the plane, so that it's very much seamless. So if I were to just draw an example, I guess. Your typical there you go. Here. So a wing body aircraft will have something that looks like this. And then your wing. There we go. Just pretend that little piece right there doesn't exist. And then your flying wing is essentially just there you go. It's similar, but hopefully you can see what I'm trying to get to here. The fuselage is very much noticeable on the wing body compared to that of a flying wing. Okay, let's see, where are we at here? Alright, so interference drag. So the thing about interference drag that's good to know is that interference drag increases as a function of the angle between multiple bodies. For this, we're going to say that the angle is going to be denoted as we're going to denote the angle between them simply as theta. It's a really nice angle one. So, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple different cases here. Okay. So our angle Alright. So let's just talk about what happens in each one. Here, no interference. Which is why, because the two bodies are in the same plane as each other, and therefore the flow can stay constant. Essentially a wing. At 120, must think it's on like flying wings or something. Probably not even that much, honestly. you're going to have low interference drag, relatively speaking. Here, I'm going to call this, we're going to call it medium interference drag, relatively speaking still. Again, all of these are relatively speaking to each other. This is going to be high interference drag. Now what we find here is that as the angle approaches 0 from 180, the interference drag increases significantly. At 0 degrees, theta equals 180 degrees. To be very, very important to know, if they are at 0 degrees, then it is now back to being at 180. Alright, so what happens if we look at an angle that's like this? This angle now, theta, is 270 degrees. Well, that wouldn't make sense, right? Because clearly we can see there's a smaller angle on the bottom. We're going to call this theta I. And theta I is going to be the theta that we are specifically looking at in order to talk about interference drag. Right? So it's going to equal 360 minus 270. That's unfortunate I made this 270 in it. Make it 210. There we go. Alright. So 150 degrees, we're still going to have interference drag as we can see here. It's going to be lower, relatively speaking, to like a 90 degree or 30 degree. But it should be known that our angle here is still going to be what we're worried about. Alright, so that's interference drag. It is drag between multiple bodies. Alright, moving on. These next two drags will be fairly easy to go through. So we're going to do them both together. Base drag and afterbody drag. Alright, so base drag is, let's say we have a truck. Alright, so here's our truck. As the flow of air moves over the truck, as the air tries to come back down, let me try and redraw that real quick. It's just going to do something like this. Neglecting rotational flow that occurs due to the wheels. So like this happens. Remember we talked about the Tawanda effect, right? So ambient pressure is going to push this pressure into this region because that's considered a curve. However, the curve is so intense that there isn't enough time for the airflow to come back together, and because of that, it creates separation. So you have separated flow. And the separated flow means that you have this existing low pressure region. Because the air didn't get back together there to go back to the same speed as it once was in the front. Remember we talked about D'Alembert's paradox? Right? So the idea is that if you start with a certain amount of volume and mass of air in front of the truck, if it gets to the back of the truck, you should have the exact same conditions. But due to things like separation, that's not always the case. So you get this region of very low pressure instead of equal pressure as once you started with. So, because this is now separated, you have this region of existing low pressure, and this region of low pressure compared to this region of high pressure is going to push the truck back, creating this major suction force, just like lift. But now it's in the axial direction, so the truck is going to get pushed heavily back by drag. And this is called base drag. Base drag refers to the base. For this truck, this face right here would be considered the base. Now, whenever you have anything that just cuts off like this, it's a base. So if I had a cube, and the flow of air was like this right here would be my base. If I had an octagon, and the flow of air was like this right here, this face, would be my base. Let me see here. I'm just trying to think of another cool real world example. Let's say we have a plane. Here's our plane. And we know that the rocket nozzle extends out, and it looks something like this. Well, the rocket nozzle, or the engine nozzle, I should say, is essentially going to make a flow like this. We made it straight there, but when you get to learn about propulsions and stuff, you'll learn that that's not actually the case. The flow does different things. So, for example, if the flow outside is really is actually higher pressure than the flow outside, like the ambient pressure as it's flying, you'll actually get a flow that looks something like this. An expanding flow. That's just because the pressure coming out of the nozzle is higher than the ambient, so we're just going to say that's the condition here. And what we're going to see is, or actually, usually you're actually more used to seeing a flow that looks something like this. Right? That's how people usually draw it. And that's because the flow coming out is a lower pressure than the ambient pressure. And so what we find, though, is that the flow around the rocket is going to separate, or around the planet, I should say, going to separate, because we actually have a base right here, and a base right here. And I'm pointing specifically at this face right here and right here. There is not enough time for the airflow to come back together, and therefore it causes a base drag due to separation from how heavy the curvature is. Now, base drag specifically is a very heavy curve, usually about 90 degrees as seen here. It is essentially the body has cut off, essentially creating a base. Now, what is the afterbody? Well, the afterbody is similar. So let's take a look. Let's say we made a cargo plane, right? If we made a cargo plane, And we just cut it off right here, like this. It looks somewhat like a bullet. And we get a base. However, we know this is not what cargo planes look like. We know that cargo planes actually look something like this. They're rounded, they come down, and they come out. Look something like this, right? This is a fuselage. And what you find is that the body is essentially a axis of revolution of a basic cylinder. Right? This is the nose. This is the body. And this section right here is what's called the afterbody. And the afterbody essentially adds more body line so that you don't have a base. And what it attempts to do is it attempts to bring the body to a close. The afterbody is actually, depending on who you go to, like Lockheed and Northrop all describe it differently. Boeing describes it differently than Airbus on their planes. For example, I believe Boeing considers it part of the body following the main wing. And I believe Airbus describes it as where the constant body section declines. Anyway, the afterbody is, for our sake and terms, is the part of the body that no longer follows its typical body structure. So as you can see here, it is coming to a point. Now, the reason why afterbodies are good is that it doesn't allow for base drag, so they reduce drag in that sense, but they can still have drag because they are curving. Right? We talked about it creating, at some point, it's going to create separation because of our boundary effects. So our flow here might come down, and then at some point, it separates. The flow right here is going to only be able to curve around that as much as it can before it also separates. Now, depending on what you want to say, if it's flat at the back, you could call it a base drag. But typically, this entire section is called the afterbody. And this is where the afterbody drag comes in from. When we deal with boat tails, for example, if you have a rocket, and you add a boat tail onto it, boat tails are usually used to bring the rocket body to a narrowed close to the diameter of the rocket nozzle, which we'll make rectangular for right now. And what happens is that your nozzle is exhausting, and you want your flow to try and come down into it nicely. Like this. So instead of having you just cut off, have that base drag, you have this so that it has a more laminar flow type. The issue here is that at some point it is very possible that you're going to actually have separation. So it only curves so much and then it falls off and has a little bit of separation and then tries to rejoin farther down the road due to the Kawanda effect and just a lower pressure in that region. So something more like this. And then you get a little bit of separation in here. And that separation, as we talked about before, creates a region of low pressure. The low pressure causes the rocket to be sucked backwards, creating an amount of drag. So these are afterbody drags. Alright. Next up, it's going to be our next big section. Wave drag. Okay. So wave drag. What is wave drag? Drag due to shock waves. Now here's the thing about the shock waves. they dissipate a lot of energy. So what does that essentially mean for us? Well, the dissipation of energy is a big thing. Because when we look at our, we'll get into this later on, but we talk about our total thermodynamic values. So we talk about things like total temperature and pressure and density. And the thing about pressure that we like is that our total pressure is the amount of energy available. Or, sorry, the amount of energy in the system. The static pressure is the amount of energy available for use. And then our dynamic pressure is our amount of energy in use. And so what we find out here is that with a shock wave, some of this energy is dissipated, and specifically our total pressure, which means that the amount of energy in the system that it has is less. So imagine this. Imagine we have this wall. We have two people here, and we have two people here. Now we talked about before that they go against each other. 2p and 2p. We're going to have a resultant force. We're just going to say this is a regular wall. Regular wall. We find out that the resultant force is going to equal 0p. 0 people's worth of force. But if we imagine our wall now as a shock wave, alright? So we have our two people here and our two people here. Sure, it's two people. But imagine the shock wave now is some kind of like energy drainer. I don't know if you ever play like RPGs or anything and you like siphon energy out of something or someone. You know, you like steal health like a vampire. Right? What's happening here is that we're going to now call this PA for after. Or we're going to call it P2. P1 and P2. Now, due to shock, P2, P2 is going to be less than P1 because our peeps are a little tired from work. On the right. So that's another way to imagine looking at this shockwave. So, if they're less, right, we're going to just say for the sake of this, for example, we're going to say P2 is 0.75 out of P1. Well then, if that's the case, then we get 2P1 pushing this way on this wall. And then over here we get 1.5 times P1. Therefore, our overall resultant is going to be 0.5 P1. And what this means, by the way, it's 1.5 because 2 times 0.75 is 1.5. And then times this P1 here. So we put that in front of the example. So as you can see here, that shockwave dissipating this energy is going to mean that the pressure is going to cause drag. So that's wave drag due to dissipation of energy. The next thing we want to talk about is perturbations. Perturbation effects. So let's go ahead and take a look at a flat plate. Now we're going to say the flow looks something like this, and at some point the boundary layer just has this like jump in it. This happens in hypersonic regions a lot. It's a phenomenon of the hypersonic region that because of the heat, the boundary layer will actually split off from the surface, and it'll create like two boundary layers, which is really, really spooky for stuff. We'll make it as simple as that for right now. What happens is that if this is the case, due to this boundary layer, you're going to get a oblique shockwave that occurs right here. But because it starts to go back down, we're going to get this expansion fan that happens along the way from here. And then as the flow goes back in, we're going to get an oblique shock again. Now an oblique shock is supersonic flow that is directed into the flow or itself. And what that means is if I have something like this and we have some velocities here, all of which are Mach greater than 1, if it moves upward like this, that means it's also interfering with this flow up here that's trying to move. So because of this, it becomes oblique. It is moving into itself. Expansions, fans, that is supersonic flow. That is directed away. From the flow. So if we look at this, and we look at something like this, we have our flow moving, and then the flow moves in this direction. While way out up here, it's still moving this way, and therefore it is an expansion fan. There we go. Now what happens across the oblique shock, right, is that as we come here, we have P1. Now, once we go across this oblique shock, we get P2, and then we go across this, it looks like this, and then it curves back down to P3, and then it curves back out to P4. And what we find here is that P1 is our initial condition, but once it crosses an oblique shock, the pressure increases significantly because your velocity will actually decrease across an oblique shock. Sorry, wrong way. Now, when it hits an expansion fan, the velocity will speed up again, and the pressure will go down. And then, I shouldn't write like that, because that's improper to write that way. This is how it should be written. And then, again, another oblique happens. And P3 will be less than P4, because an oblique happens. So what does this mean? This means that P1 to P2, a pressure spike happens. And then you get this region of high pressure, pushing against the region of low pressure as it goes into the expansion fan. So you see this pressure of high, pressure of low. Now what happens here is that this pressure is moving in this direction. The high pressure would like to move back, but it doesn't. It's moving forward due to the airflow velocity. But since the flow is already going this direction, you have this high pressure. Perturbations will also cause a high pressure to occur, creating this suction force, and therefore creating drag as well. So if we look at, for example, a double wedge, we get a oblique shock here, a little spipperdoodle right there, then another oblique right here. And you get this region of high pressure right here, region of low pressure right here. This is at zero angle of attack, so it's symmetric, so the shocks will be the same on both sides. Once the angle of attack changes, the shock waves are not the same on both sides. Now if we split like this, we find that the pressures pushing against each other in this direction and this direction will cancel out due to symmetry. But if we split it like this, we find that it's our scenario of the P1 versus P2 from earlier, and we'll get a resultant drag force in this direction due to the wave drags. So that's what we're getting in terms of waves, shockwaves creating drag due to 1, dissipating the total amount of energy you have in your system, and 2, pressure gradients due to deflections onto the body surface. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into our first equation for waves. So we have CdW, supposed to be writing in green right now. Oh no, why this went away? There we go. Alright, so CdW. And this is going to equal, for a flat plate, four times the angle of attack divided by hold on, let me remember. The root of m squared minus 1. Alright. This is for a flat plate. Now, when we look at our modified airfoils, such as the modified double wedge and the modified biconvex, depending on their thicknesses, we can approximate them as a flat plate. Now, for a straight up double wedge, we say it's 4 because the angle of attack was T over C over the root of m squared minus 1. Remembering that this is an angle of attack. T is going to equal our thickness. C is going to equal our chord. If I remember correctly. I don't believe C is referring to the camber line here. C might actually be referring to the camber line here. Camber line, sorry, camber line. But to get more specific on this equation, so that we're not just limiting ourselves to that of the double wedge, although I do believe this is referring more to the chord here. Is, and I'm going to rewrite down here, CdW, in terms of any airfoil you have, is going to be equivalent to 4. Make sure I write this correctly for you. alpha squared plus g of t squared plus, how did I write this? G of t, I believe? G of s squared. Divided by square root m squared minus 1. And here, alpha is still your angle of attack. GT is your function of your airfoil for the thickness. And then GS is the function of the airfoil for the camber line. And then you will find that the total drag of your wing is going to equal CDW plus CF or this equation if it's a symmetric airfoil. Okay. So that's where we're at with wave drag. Actually explained that quicker than I thought it would. We're about to hit the 2-hour mark here, and we still have a bit amount left. Hope we can knock it out in the next half hour. Next one we're going to talk about here, these next ones are real quick though. So, ram drag. So what is ram drag? Ram drag is it's an efficiency numeric. Unlike the other drags, this drag is kind of related to that, but it's much more about the efficiency of a engine. We're simply using the engine intakes. And the reason for this is because what happens is that your engine's combustion and everything depends on a certain velocity of air in order for it to be effective. There's efficiency ratios for your combustor, for your condenser, for your turbine, for your burner, and all these things rely on what velocity of air they are getting. And so as the air changes within the opening of the intake, you may not get as much thrust from your engine. And because thrust is lost, due to the velocity of air, anything that, for our sake, goes against the forward motion of your aircraft is a drag. Hence the name ram drag. There's also something called additive drag and lip drag. And these drags are caused by the actual lip creating drag. So you're gonna get some more skin friction drag from that. they're also going to create pressure gradients on them, and because of that, they will also generate drag forces. Specifically, I can draw something. Say here's our nacelle, and here's our lip. Looks something like this. Somewhere like right here, we have our compressor fans or something. You get the gist of it. And then it's connected to the shaft, which goes all the way over to the turbine. Anyway, as the velocity of the flow goes in, what happens is you get the flow that comes over like this, and the flow that comes over here. And first of all, the velocity that goes outside is called spillage. And then you have skin friction and pressure drags that happen along this region here. So you get what are called lip and additive drags. And all of this comes from ram drag. Alright, so that's that for engines, fuel breathing there, or air breathing. Let's go ahead and move on to our next one, cavity drag. Alright, so what is cavity drag? Cavity drag is drag due to cavities. So imagine we have this, and I draw some indent in our body. As the flow hits, it might try and go down. If it goes down, it's going to push off here. And this cavity creates rotational flow. Also, as it hits here, it has essentially another stagnation point, and not really, but it's going to create an increase of pressure as it hits here, because the flow is going to immediately slow down due to it now having a vertical component. And so you have some pressure 1 here, pressure 2 here, pressure 3 here, pressure 4 here. And what we find is that pressure 3 is going to be higher than that of pressure 4. And because of that, it's going to create a resultant drag force pushing the body backwards. That's a cavity drag. Additionally, we have P2 going down. Going to this region here where there's low pressure. Essentially, you have a small amount of base drag here. So you also get a little region of essentially a local base. We were talking about base drag before, and how that creates a drag region. Okay, so that's cavity drag. There's a lot of research still going on about cavity drag. One of the professors at the university, Professor Dr. Xiaofeng Liu, great professor by the way, has done a lot of research with cavity flow. He's also done a lot of research with vertical flow over supersonic planes on both delta and trapezoidal planforms. Let's see here. So this is cavity drag. Essentially, if you have a cavity, you're going to create a drag region. Say that when you open up the windows on your car, flow goes into your car, it's going to push against the back of your car, drag. The next one we're going to talk about is cavitation drag. Not to be confused with cavity drag. It's all about cavitation. This is a huge thing if you are designing submarines. So, here's our submarine. Has a little afterbody in the back here. Just drag. pretend it's like the Sea Wolf submarine or something. Did you know that there are also airfoils on submarines? Because fluid dynamics has the same fundamental properties in water as well. That's why it's called fluid dynamics. It uses a subsonic shape for its body. So anyway, let's go ahead and get to cavitation. So cavitation is, let's say this, the flow is going over the sub. The flow as it goes to the sub, the electric temperature is going to speed up. And it's possible that the flow on the submarine is moving so fast that the pressure drops to a point to where the water molecules turn to vapor. And what happens is that once it turns into vapor, it has different properties. So it turns into this vapor bubble. But then the pressure drops back down. And what happens is that it wants to turn back into water. So what happens is that you essentially get these microbursts of exploding bubbles. Alright, so what happens is that, imagine we have this bubble, and it's now gas. Then all this pressure is now around this small little bubble, trying to get rid of it. Well, that bubble, the air in it, is either going to try and go up really quickly, and as it does that, its pressure is going to end up decreasing over time due to viscosity, and it's going to turn back into water. And what we find is that this bubble creates suction as it wants to go into the very low pressure region of the gas. And so imagine if you have your body and it's trying to get sucked in to these bubbles, and thousands of these bubbles are being created at the same time very quickly, and they form and implode in instants. And not only does it cause drag, but it's also horrible for our body. It can cause it can destroy, it can eat through metal due to the heat and the force that comes out from them. Essentially little small micro sonic booms happening. You also don't want cavitation if you're trying to be silent, because cavitation generates a lot of noise easily picked up on sonar. So that's cavitation. Alright, that is all in terms of the drags, but the last thing we're going to do for today, cool, I managed to get 3 of those things out in about 5 minutes, is I want to talk about design. Go ahead and drink some water real quick. And take a bite of this Hershey's. Okay. Let's go in order. Skin friction. How do we reduce skin friction? The answer is really easy. Less surface area. So we have a wedge like this. We will find that, we'll call this wedge 1, wedge 2. The amount of shear force on wedge 1 will be more than that on wedge 2, because wedge 2 has less surface area. Alright, next up. Form drag. Streamline bodies. We'll make nicer bodies that have less form drag. Smooth bodies. I'll add this skin friction too. Now you might be wondering, why does smooth bodies have to affect form drag? When that's something that bothers friction forces. Well, microscopically smooth is good. Let's say you have a body that isn't microscopically smooth. This again goes into streamline. So you have a body that looks like something like this. You just start getting separations just because of the form itself. Viscosity doesn't even need to do anything about it. Curvature won't be enough. The quantum effect won't be able to take form, and therefore the form drag will come into place. Alright, next up. Also, they're kind of counterintuitive to each other, because if you have the same object but you make it longer and longer, you'll essentially get less drag, form drags of certain types, but you'll definitely get more skin friction. So there's a lot of trade-offs when it comes down to designing for drag. Next one we talked about was Induced Drag. This turns pretty quick as well. Wingtips. Wingtips will reduce wingtip vortices. They're not good though on stealth planes. Or fighter aircraft. It's not really great things. Maneuverable planes, don't use wingtips. Planes that continue to go distance want to be very effective and efficient, like airliners or gliders. Wingtips, very useful. Swept wings. Swept wings will allow for the, I'm trying to think of the word here. Will allow for more span-wise flow, so you'll get more like viscous induced. But having swept wings means that the airflow might actually leave the wing before you get to the wingtip. So this one's a trade-off. Longer wings. Less surface area. Together, higher aspect ratio. Alright. So that's not for induced drag. Next up, we have interference drag. rounds, chamfers at angles between bodies. Closer to 180 degrees. The reason why this works, because we have this right here. This is a direct change of 90 degrees. If I do something like this, what we get is an angle that looks something like this. Oops, go back. We get angles that look something like this. It comes in steps. And so those steps, more importantly, if you were to draw some tangencies, come on, window. Yeah, a point where I've drawn so much on window, it doesn't even understand what's happening anymore. We'll find that if we were to take an angle right here, make it perpendicular. I'm sorry, not perpendicular. We want two tangency points. So we have the tangency point going back down this way, such as this, and we have the tangency point going up. So if we look at that, we have this really big angle. And so by having these curves, essentially has an angle change that is really, really large. And because of that, the amount of interference drag you'll get there is much less. Okay. Base drag. Don't cut off the body. Use an afterbody. Streamline body. All of those will reduce base drag, or eliminate it completely. On the same line, we're going to talk about the afterbody drag. And here, streamline again. Gradual curve. That's about it for afterbody. Alright, we're going to move on now to wave drag. That's how we do a wave drag. Okay. Remove blunts. Smaller oblique angles. The more an oblique angle happens, the harder your pressure. Smaller, column expansion angles. That way your pressure doesn't drop too low significantly, unless you're trying to create more lift. Those are pretty much the biggest things for removing wave drag. This one thing is called the area roll. Essentially, the area roll is gradual increase and decrease of cross section. Let's see. Anything else I can think about right now? Okay, that's essentially it for right now. Alright, next up, ram drag. I'm not a huge propulsion guy, but ram drag. Train an engine for planned flight conditions. And also an aerodynamic intake. Cavity drag. Remove cavity is the easiest way to get rid of cavity drag. But if you cannot do that, then streamline the cavity. For example, this into that. Okay. And last up, Cavitation Drag. Essentially like the transonic for water vessels. But Cavitation Drag, in order to reduce that, just had to design a body that doesn't accelerate the flow so much. You could try adding like buffers along your body, but that creates a drag of its own type after that. So it's all dependent. But that is about it. We got it here at 320. Cool, cool. Alright, so as a recap, we went over what drag is. We went over the different kinds of drag, skin friction, form drag, interference drag, induced drag, base drag, afterbody drag, wave drag, ram drag, cavity drag, and cavitation drag. Just now I went over some design elements to ease the amount of drag. It should be understood that making an optimized vehicle is very hard to do. Because whenever you improve one thing, you're trading off with something else, usually. So, sometimes if you reduce drag, you're also going to be reducing your lift. Sometimes if you try and increase your lift, you'll be increasing your drag. So, there's a whole lot that goes into this good stuff, but it's all fun in the end. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this was useful, and it'll be uploaded to the Confluence. I'll catch y'all later. Peace!